July 6th, 1714. James Fitzjames, the Duke of Berwick, assumed command of the Franco-Spanish army laying siege to Barcelona, replacing the previous commander, the Duke of Popoli. With Berwick came more reinforcements: infantry, cavalry, engineers, supplies, and plenty of artillery. These men were veterans of the great battles of the War of the Spanish Succession, which just ended for most of its belligerents. Beforehand, 39,000 men were posted to Catalonia. Now that number skyrocketed to 86,000, an average of one French or Spanish soldier per Catalan family. Berwick was also an experienced commander. He first served in the 9 Years' War in the service of the Jacobites. Their defeat by William III of Orange drove him to join the French army. Later in the war, he led a division against the Allies at Steenkerk, where he distinguished himself. He once again offered his services as the new war broke out. He would win the Bourbons' first decisive victory at the Battle of Almanza, wherein he outmaneuvered and destroyed an Anglo-Allied army led by the Earl of Galway. It's no wonder that he was the man appointed to conquer the last stronghold of Philip V's enemies. Berwick began his campaign by completely rejecting Popoli's blockade. He was advised by Verboom to shift focus to the northeastern side of the city. During his time as a prisoner in Barcelona, the Dutchman took note of weak points. He found the terrain optimal for digging, and the interval between the Santa Clara and Portal Nou bastions could provide room for sappers to break through. During the night of July 12th, 2,500 French sappers dug toward their objective. They worked fast, for the next morning the breach was nearly complete, and the first parallel had been built. Villarroel took notice, and the next day he led a sortie of 4,000 infantry and 500 cavalry to destroy it. The attack was initially successful, but the resistance of the Bourbon infantry was far stiffer than expected. Losses are unknown, but Villarroel's men paid a higher toll than they wished, so they slipped away back into the defenses. The sortie failed, and the first parallel was finished. On July 16th, a second parallel had come under construction. Franco-Spanish sappers dug tirelessly, while under heavy artillery fire from Barcelona's walls. Losses were quickly piling up, so Berwick had artillery and mortars placed along the second parallel as quickly as possible. These large batteries provided enough cover for the men to continue their work, and heavily damaged the bastions of Santa Clara, Levante, and Portal Nou. The Catalan gunners' respected accuracy and coolness under fire stood no chance. Several breaches were made, and one much larger in the soon-to-be-named Royal Breach. Mere days later, the third parallel would be completed. Villarroel had been surprised by the speed of Berwick's engineers, and frightened by their potential. The third parallel was being used by Bourbon engineers to begin excavating tunnels at the foot of the walls. Villarroel knew that they would be placing mines there soon, and that he had no time to remove them. It took a little longer than anticipated, but Berwick would finally decide to launch the first real assault on August 12th, on the Santa Clara bastion. On the early morning of August 12th, French sappers primed explosives under the bastions of Santa Clara and Portal Nou. Before long, they erupted in a burst of flame, disorienting the Catalan defenders. Company after company from the battalion stormed the two bastions, actually managing to capture them for a short time. Catalan professional troops, with city militia, counterattacked. The sanguinary combat will last all day. The French Artois infantry suffered the most, losing most of its officers. And finally, the fighting came to an end when the company of law students, a company of one of the city's militia battalions, drove the last assailants out at bayonet point. The Catalans reported 78 killed and 118 wounded. Berwick had lost 900. The failed assault was dealt a major blow, but the Marshal wasn't ready to quit. Instead, he used the cover of night to organize another assault. The objective was still the same, and this time he personally organized the vanguard and directed the artillery to fire only on his order. Dorrell also shifted his forces, leaving 170 men from 2 companies of the militia to hold the Santa Clara bastion, while a more mixed force of regulars and volunteers held the Portal Nou. He also brought up additional artillery support. At 10 p.m. on August 13th, the Bourbons' guns opened up. Berwick used this as a feint to confuse the Catalans into believing a general attack along the whole line was to come. This fire covered the first wave of sappers, who cleared the rubble from the breaches. But it was only a matter of time until they came under a shower of bullets from the defenders, which initially prevented them from advancing. In addition, the French vanguard followed up in support too soon, and both elements began taking heavy losses. These mounted as another company and the regiment Deputatio poured fire into the Frenchmen stuck in the moat. It took 2 bloody hours, but the sappers finally cleared the way, and the Bourbon troops poured in, taking the barricades in grim hand-to-hand fighting and wiping out most of the defenders. The regulars sallied forward to drive them back, but in vain. The regulars fell back, and the French took the center of the bastion. Now they would just need to hold on to it. Berwick's feinting attacks had worked, and Villarroel only now noticed he had been tricked. He then ordered 3 battalions of the regulars, and another 700-strong militia battalion to immediately retake it. They attempted to deliver a crushing blow while the Bourbons were still organizing, but they found that the enemy was far more prepared than expected at the foot of the breach, and the Bourbon infantry repelled 2 assaults that night. The savage melee continued early into the next day. At one point around 4 in the morning, musket fire had become so intense that it ignited a magazine near the Catalan barricades, killing 70 of them instantly, and sowing panic in the rest. The defenders nearly collapsed, but Villarroel personally intervened, rallying the troops and bringing forward fresh companies to relieve the decimated units that had been fighting all night. The Bourbons kept fighting as well, but they were not relieved, and now they only possessed half of the bastion. To relieve their own men, the Bourbons brought up the elite Spanish and Walloon Guard regiments to make the next, and hopefully final, assault. The Catalan counterattack began at noon, just as the Guardsmen raced up to the breaches to make theirs. However, they could not reach their barricades in time, as the fresh defenders charged down the rubble in a pincer movement, trapping those who could not escape, and killing them. Casualties on both sides were said to be high, but specifics are unknown. Berwick could only face the truth of this botched endeavor, and wrote to the king. Your Majesty will see, as far as I am honored to tell you, the enemies defend themselves desperately, perhaps better than regular troops would, so that this work becomes serious and long, since it is not advisable to risk again an action of some importance before putting ourselves in a state of attacking the breaches of the place, since this could kill our troops, and we would lose our best men. We will move forward as wisely as possible. The Bourbon officers had become impatient due to suffering 2 defeats in a row, in addition to months of slow progress. They begged Berwick to try again, but the Marshal refused. He would instead adopt a new approach. He opted for a systematic bombardment of the walls for several more weeks. This, he hoped, would create larger breaches for his battalions, unlike the smaller ones that funneled his troops into killing zones before. In the city, morale on the Catalan side was high, but their numbers were rapidly dwindling. It was only a matter of time that severe starvation and disease, as well as limited ordnance, took full effect. Casanova had pinned hopes on the partisans and professional troops still fighting outside of the city, particularly those of the Marquis of Paul. This was not without reason, for the partisans had won a minor tactical victory over the Duke of Montemar at Talamanca on August 14th. This did not prevent the Bourbons from winning elsewhere, however, and any attempts to break the blockade had been thwarted on land by Berwick and at sea by Admiral Ducasse. By September 3rd, Barcelona was at its limits. Negotiations were initiated, and both sides met to discuss the matter. Berwick proposed the terms of capitulation to Casanova, who, in turn, announced a state of the siege to the three commons of Catalonia. There was still 2 to 3 days' worth of gunpowder left to sustain a resistance, and that a 12-day negotiation would be convenient in this time. However, the proposal was firmly rejected by the three columns, and a message was sent to Berwick stating, "The three commons have met, and having considered the proposition made by an officer of the enemies, they answer that they do not want to hear nor accept any proposal from the enemy." An exhausted Villarroel requested to leave the city and resign his position. He was told the next convoy out of Barcelona would be on September 11th, the day of Berwick's final assault. By September 11th, the defenders had built 3 lines of defenses and worked on their most damaged bastions. Again, the first defenses were at the Santa Clara, Levante, and Portalno bastions. However, the weeks of bombardment opened up much wider breaches, especially in the Royal Breach, which stretched 140 meters. In case of an assault, the defenders laid mines below it. All the mentioned areas had been further reinforced with troops and small amounts of artillery. If the Bourbons successfully stormed into the city, La Travesera had been built as a last resort. The last point of defense was the Montjuic Castle, on the hills outside of the city. The defenders were down to 6,295 troops, only about half of which were fit for service. In stark contrast, Berwick had coordinated an attack surrounding the whole city with 19,000 men. He planned to hit the center defenses the hardest, forcing the Catalans to commit most of their forces there, while his wings opened up the gates to his cavalry. Such an assault was designed to force the Catalans to capitulate by overwhelming force. At 4:30 a.m. on September 11th, every gun the Bourbons had fired their first salvo, beginning the assault of the day. 2 more salvos followed, as the cavalry and infantry advanced in 3 wings. The first assaults were concentrated on the Portalno bastion by Marshal Castillo's 11,000 men. The infantry attacked the 2 positions 4 times, but each time they were driven back by heavy artillery fire. Bourbon cavalry then rode around the perimeter to create further diversions, forcing the decimated Catalan units to divert forces wherever they felt the probability of a breakthrough. Castillo's forces at first avoided assaulting the Royal Breach, fearing the possibility of exploding mines. It was soon discovered, however, that these were inoperable. In their attack, they were at first met with desperate resistance, but more French infantry attacked these defenders from the rear, and the Bourbons had their first entry into the city. Combined forces attacking the Portalno bastion and those pouring in from the Royal Breach finally came together and occupied the long-contested bastion. The fall of the Portalno bastion made defending the Santa Clara one impossible, and the defenders fell back to the Travesera with those from Portalno. Chateau forts dismounted dragoons and cavalry taking the Santa Eulalia redoubt in quick, yet bitter fighting. The defenders fell back again to the Levante bastion, clinging on in a brutal slugging match with Berwick's infantry. Chateau Fort's cavalry moved quickly along the sea wall as the Bourbons finally began entering the city en masse. Although the dragoons were repulsed from threatening the flank of the wall, it was becoming clear to the Catalans. They could no longer hold the Travesera. The troops in the Levante bastion had been overwhelmed, with all but 300 killed. The line was lightly reinforced by the last reserves of the city's garrison. By now, most of these companies numbered just around 30 to 60 men. But the arrival of these reserves allowed time for the Catalans to hold just a little longer. Villarroel, who had rejoined the defense when the artillery barrage began, personally rallied and organized the line. He had been fighting like everyone else all day, and his professionalism kept morale afloat. At 7 a.m., the Catalans had brought forward anything they had left and organized a last-ditch counterattack. It was led by the chief counselor Rafael Casanova himself, under the flag of Santa Eulalia. This move was unexpected, taking Berwick by surprise. The area before the Saint-Père and Jonqueres bastion saw the hardest fighting, as the Bourbons were pushed back to them. The Catalans then turned their attention to the Portalnau bastion, the scene of some of the siege's most sanguinary fighting. The Bourbons organized themselves here, however, and repelled the charge. Amidst it all, Casanova became badly wounded leading the city militia. At the Levante bastion, Villarroel was supported by dismounted cavalry in his attack, driving back the infantry and dismounted troops of the Bourbons. A volley from supporting units halted Villarroel's efforts, however. From this, a musket ball struck one of his legs, so he too had to be carried from the front. The Catalan counterattack had lasted for an hour and a half. It did achieve initial success, but in the end, failed to throw back the French. At 8:30 a.m., Berwick launched his own counterattack. The reinforcements and survivors surged forward, retaking their lost gains and penetrating the Travesera in many areas. Fighting continued on to 2 p.m., when the lines of both sides eventually stabilized. The Catalans weighed the option of launching another counterattack or choosing to negotiate. With every man engaged, almost every bullet spent, and almost all the gunpowder used up, it was firmly decided that the time to negotiate surrender had come. Berwick's terms involved respect to the inhabitants. He would allow the remaining garrison to retire outside the city without their arms, which were to be placed inside the palace. The castle of Montjuic would surrender the same day, and all the remaining horses, wagons, and supplies would be given to Berwick. Lastly, the fortress of Cardona, still holding out, would surrender the next day. All requests were fulfilled by the Catalans, and Berwick kept his word. Everything that the city had ordered was carried out promptly, so that when the field officers passed through the streets, we admired the coolness with which all the common people of both sexes, who worked at the tasks of their trades as if they had never had the martial and intrepid spirits with which, in a year of blockade and more than 40 days of siege, they had withstood 2 formidable armies. It seems to me, said the Duke of Berwick, what glory this nation would have acquired if it had made such an obstinate defense in favor of its king. Wrote one Spanish captain, Alos. The survivors did their best to return to normal life, even as a third of the city had been destroyed and columns of corpses littered the streets. During Berwick's command over the forces besieging Barcelona, it is estimated that 14,200 men of the Bourbon army had been killed or wounded. For the defenders, 6,850 to 8,000 had suffered the same fate. It is unknown the number of civilians killed or raped in the assault of September 11th. On the 14th, the Catalan army was entirely disbanded, their regimental flags turned over to the Bourbons. Those who wished were allowed to serve in the army of Philip V. The 3 columns and Board of 24 were also completely dissolved. Their last order to the citizens was to not show further resistance to the occupiers. They ordered that no countryman should speak of the past, that the artisans and women work at the doors of their homes, like before the war. On September 20th, Berwick had no choice but to finally turn over the city to Philip V. Dorrell and all the other military officers and political representatives of the rebellion were imprisoned. This was a direct violation of Berwick's terms, but nothing was to be done. They were imprisoned for 11 years. Some were executed. By 1715, all rebelling provinces, including the island of Majorca, had been occupied and placed back under the absolutist rule of Philip V. The desperate last stand of the Catalans in their effort for independence had been thoroughly crushed. Their laws, constitutions, and privileges had been dissolved. The September 11th of 1714 remains both a great scar and even a somewhat glorious memory of the Catalan people, who sometimes referred to the rebellion as a separate war. Throughout the next few hundred years, the military rule of Philip V would fade away, allowing for dreams of an autonomous rule in the region to ferment once more. September 11th is locally known as the National Day of Catalonia, and has been brought up in recent independence movements as recently as 2014 and 2021. Lastly, of course, it proved to be the true end of hostilities, of the 13-year War of the Spanish Succession.